I would say the reason why people fall into insurance is because it seems like a really obvious use case, right? We think about risk, and when you dive into the detail from an outside perspective, you realize a lot of things don't work the way that you think they do. And I think one of the things that we found is, number one, realize who in the space is doing things really well and don't duplicate that effort. Think about how you can go from a customer view perspective and see, okay, where are those gaps, if there are gaps, and how would you best use your product to fill those gaps?
So we went from exploring the rise of niche models to exploring the rise of a niche model. And that is Paige, who works at Ocean Ledger. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, Ocean Ledger, and why you founded the company?
So I'll try and keep it a little bit brief. So a lot of people say they fall into insurance. I think I dived headfirst into it. But where I came from originally was looking at risk from an environmental perspective. So marine biologist background. I've been diving since I was 10. I did loads of field research and ended up realizing that that wasn't a real career I wanted to pursue after getting my degree in that space. And so I then took the opportunity to zoom out as much as you possibly can and work in banking. And so I spent a few years working in the financial service sector, and eventually got the itch to move back to the space and realized there was this problem that a lot of banks actually were calling out in terms of the standardization of data required to know, say, where ecosystems are and understand how that can be integrated into various different financing mechanisms. And that's kind of what first started Ocean Ledger, actually, as a research spin out. So my co-founder, kind of opposite path of me, spent about 8 years looking into how can we take the latest and greatest of satellite imagery, of various validation techniques, of computing costs coming down, to figure out how to map ecosystems with higher fidelity and accuracy. So originally the gap that Ocean Ledger as a sub-niche modeling provider looked to solve was how do we look at nature risk? How do we look at ecosystems where they're declining, where they're stable, and save money on putting people in the field, a target where those surveys happened. And what then, I guess, brought us more into this fold and this space was thinking, well, actually, where those ecosystems are in many parts of the world actually form that view of vulnerability, and maybe part of those defenses that we talk about, or even the elevation. And so I guess Ocean Ledger's sort of had this whirlwind tour and just had recently gone through Lloyd's Lab, firstly to answer the question of, do we do something that other people don't already do really well? And so that was a real soul-searching journey for the company amongst, a space with extremely credible flood risk providers. And where we landed was that we care about how that coastline is shaped, where those natural defenses are, how it's eroded over time, and did a number of different pilots and understanding that actually that is really material if we are then going to link it to, say, a surge model and partner with another company. So that's kind of how we ended up, I would say, jumping headfirst into insurance, always being fascinated by it at the end of the risk cycle, essentially. How is it that an insurer would think about this view of risk? And then how can we, as a niche provider, go across that risk cycle and look at lending, look at private equity, and those other, potential avenues for our modeling output.
Brilliant, thank you. And I guess having been at Fathom for a while and I guess seen its growth, we've explored the difficulties, I would say, in selling into the insurance market as a startup. So I guess my question next is, what are the challenges you've experienced as a startup selling into insurance? And how do you differentiate yourself and compete in a market that is dominated by a duopoly?
I would say the reason why people fall into insurance is because it seems like a really obvious use case, right? We think about risk, and when you dive into the detail from an outside perspective, you realize a lot of things don't work the way that you think they do. And I think one of the things that we found is, number one, like I alluded to earlier, is realize who in the space is doing things really well and don't duplicate that effort. Think about how you can go from a customer view perspective and see, okay, where are those gaps, if there are gaps, and how would you best use your product to fill those gaps? So as in give that customer access to data. So via Oasis, via another third-party provider, or say direct. And so that was number one. As I said, that was a big part of the learning we had through Lloyd's Lab, not coming completely outside of the industry. But one thing that has, I think, been challenging, and I'm sure a lot of people can relate to this, is understanding really where your company, whether you're a carrier or a broker, realistically where your appetite is to innovate, because there's no blanket solution in adopting new technologies, and frankly it's really risky working with an early stage vendor. And so I think the first thing is, are you the right person to even be speaking to that vendor? Is there a process in place? Is there any appetite really from a budget perspective, if there is a challenge identified and a solution available, to go ahead and pilot that? Because I think that's where you can have appetite, but the implementation doesn't follow through. And so what I found, I mean, in the US generally, not to generalize too much, is a willingness to say, hey, let's try something new. And Lloyd's, I think, is an amazing organization which has the appetite, but sometimes the implementation side of things, the processes required to go through that and then also eventually adopt that solution, if it's successful, change or it can be unclear. And I think it's really on the part, I would say, of that startup as well as the person that you're speaking to really just be honest about where you're at in that journey and whether it makes sense to even continue a conversation.
Absolutely. And when we were very early stage, there's actually many people in this audience that helped Fathom get to where it is today. And those companies, I guess, onboarding and probably taking a risk on these early stage models is really crucial, not just to obviously the startup itself, but also to the industry. If we are just dominated by two model vendors, and they are crucial for the industry, but if we're dominated by them, then everyone's just converging on a singular view of risk, and that's dangerous for us as a insurance community, as exposure managers, as risk managers as well. I guess on that basis, what can the audience here today do to help foster a more innovative startup community within the cat modeling space and within London? What can they do to help you as well?
So many things. I think just touching on the earlier point, it maybe takes about 10 minutes to just give really honest feedback and say, hey, we are maybe, hey, I don't have the answer actually, so I would have to ask someone else. Am I willing to do that? Just say yes or no. Giving honest feedback on, one, why is this not a fit? We don't think maybe your credit, we want to see the validation that we see in our other providers. We think that what you're doing is maybe duplicative. We think there's just not a need for it right now. We're happy with our view of risk. Spending the 10 odd minutes of just writing out a couple sentences is absolute gold for a company who then can take that away and validate, okay, well, that's not maybe the right customer at this time, but how can I, in the meantime, bridge a path forward to be useful one day? Or at least to know, hey, maybe this actually isn't, we're not solving a real customer problem here. And I think that's a really underrated thing that can also just build real trust and transparency amongst different companies. So even carriers, I understand, are not really comfortable sharing how they go about doing model validation or, where they have the real gaps. But if you engage with your Fathom or your Reask or whatever other big cat vendor model that you're working with and say, hey, I feel that there are gaps here. One, let them say, how can we solve this, right? By pushing on the science and coming up with new features. Or, hey, actually, we know some people in our network or this other data vendor. Allow them also to go do the work almost on your behalf, right? Where your resourcing might be limited, and find people who can ultimately improve that internal view of risk or whatever that gap you feel is preventing you from having as much confidence as you possibly can. So yeah, two things. One, honest feedback, and two, rely on your vendors, because I think as we've heard today, the best ones are going to be transparent. And the best ones are going to be your advocate and almost help filter really high quality companies to help either work directly with you or in conjunction as partners.
How can the audience get in touch with you, and how can they find out more about Ocean Ledger?
So we're a 10-minute walk. We're in Lloyd's Lab. I've got old-fashioned business cards and LinkedIn I'm happy to distribute. But yeah, we're in Lloyd's Lab, so we're in the area and able to grab a coffee with anyone who wants to continue the convo.
Brilliant. There we go. Thank you very much.